So this is a really weird instance where I've already recorded this entire video and I didn't record an intro, because when I was doing this video right here, comparing these two coolers, I was also recording like 4 or 5 other videos at a time, and all of the results for this test I just kind of did at the end of a different video. I'm gonna do the intro now to explain what's going on. So there's really not much to this, like, that I have to explain. It's the NZXT Kraken X62 280mm liquid cooler versus the Corsair IQ H117i Elite Capellix 420mm cooler. Now, both of these brands here are like top tier for some of the best liquid coolers you can get, and the 280 just kind of looked out of place on it because it didn't fill up the entire front. So mostly I was getting this just for aesthetic, because this cooler, I never had issues with it at all cooling down that i9. So now I've just completely wiped all of like the benchmark results from this video, so they're not going to be click on the benchmark and then it runs and then it just shows like the result at the end and then it like fast forwards through a whole bunch of stuff. Like, I'm not going to do that, because even though a lot of you liked to see those things, that means that the videos end up being like over 20 minutes long. So I've cut all of that out to try and drastically reduce the length of this video. Now, I was using this cooler before in the old computer for about a year. However, I've never had any kind of like degrading in performance. It has worked as good as it has day one as it does when I was running these tests. However, I did just change the thermal compound on it before running the benchmarks. So as soon as I had the computer ready to go, I popped off the panel, I popped the cooler off, cleaned the thermal compound, and then I reapplied a new application of Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. Then I ran all the benchmarks, logged all of the results, made a complete separate video on how to install this 420mm cooler in the Fractal Torrent, because it's just an absolute nightmare trying to install this. And then that was where the confusion happened, where I ended up saying all of the results at the end of the video where I was installing this. But the exact same thing happened, where I cleaned off the factory compound that this comes with, and I applied Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. Exact same application, same compound, same tube. The fan speed was locked for both coolers, so the only difference throughout all of the tests was the 280mm size and the 420mm size. Now, I've already edited like the entire thing, so like the results are actually really interesting, but I don't want this video to be too long, so we're just gonna dive straight into the results. Okay, so I just stopped the thermal test here, and I popped the glass off just so we can actually see everything better. Interesting results. I mean, it kind of makes sense. One of them doesn't. It actually confuses me. I don't understand what happened. But right here I have the results beforehand. I took the CPU block off, I cleaned it all off, I put new thermal compound, I put everything together, and then I ran all of the benchmarks. This new cooler here, the Corsair H117i, I cleaned off the stock thermal compound before putting it on, and I used Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. So both of these tests were done with brand new compound for the first duration of the stress test. So the first test with the Kraken X62, I was at 68 degrees Celsius. With the H170i, 66 degrees Celsius. So the difference between a 280 with a push-pull configuration to a 420 with a push-pull configuration, I've only gained 2 degrees Celsius drop using the exact same thermal compound and everything. 2 degrees Celsius. That's it. So it is running a little bit cooler. Awesome improvement. Was it worth $315 Canadian? Absolutely not. But it does look nicer because everything's very symmetrical. I ended up cutting this bracket here. That way it would fit underneath the fan portion, because I've cut it right here because it can't fit under the rad. But that was to allow me to put these two fans on the bottom. So that way I wasn't reducing GPU temperature, which before the GPU temperature was 59.5 degrees Celsius, and now it's 61.4 degrees Celsius. So even though I cut this bracket to put these fans back in, because the rad extends further down, so now hotter air from the CPU is coming through onto the GPU temperature has actually increased by almost 2 degrees Celsius, just because of this extension right here for the CPU temperature to be coming out toward the GPU. Even though I have these lower fans here, it still increased the temperature. So these bottom fans will have to be configured so the fan curve is related to the GPU, not the CPU. So that way I can get more airflow over the GPU to keep that temperature down. Because this whole setup right here actually increased the GPU temperature by almost 2 degrees Celsius, but I reduced the CPU temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. So it's almost an exact trade-off. Like 2 degrees colder, almost 2 degrees hotter. The temperature just changed, have more surface area over here to cool the CPU, but then that extra heat was transferred to the GPU through the fans blowing the hot air on it. Next, we have the memory channels, which is going from this far left one all the way to the right. So this first one right here used to be at 43 degrees Celsius. The next one was 45.5. Third one was 46.7. And the fourth one, in direct contact with airflow off of the rad, was at 40.8. So that was actually pretty good because it has direct airflow into it. Now, after everything that's been changed, this first one right here is 47.4. This second one is 48.9. The third one is 49.5. And this last one right here is 46.3. So, like, this doesn't make any sense to me. We have a lower CPU temperature, so that means that the air coming off of these fans is cooler because the liquid temperature has decreased enough to reduce the temperature on the CPU. We have more fans for surface area for cooling, yet somehow every single memory module has a higher temperature. Even with the upward airflow, higher temperatures. So I don't know if it's coming directly off of the GPU because this fan is heating up the GPU more, so maybe this fan is blowing the hotter air up toward the memory. That's the only thing that kind of makes sense to me. But the only issue with that is the NVMEs. Because before I was sitting at 43 on this top one, 40 on the middle one, and then 41 on the bottom one. Now it's sitting at 42. So we've dropped 1 degree Celsius there, 35 in the middle. So that's a whole 5 degrees Celsius drop. And then 42 on the bottom, which actually increased by 1 degree Celsius. So these temperatures are all over the place, and I'm not entirely sure what's going on. But basically what happened between the last test using the NZXT Kraken X62 and the Corsair H117i is that I spent $315 on this cooler, and then I got all 6 fans with the controller on sale for $180. And I got absolutely nowhere. The memory temperatures are higher. The NVMe temperatures are lower, significantly lower, and higher. So those are all over the place. The CPU temperature is 2 degrees less, and the GPU temperature is almost 2 degrees more. So the moral of the story here is I paid a ridiculous amount of money to add one fan and have different RGB on the CPU block. That's basically what this comes down to, is that in a completely stock configuration, a 280 millimeter rad is exactly as good as a 420 millimeter rad. So this rad right here is only going to be justified with overclocking, which I didn't test before, and I also didn't thermal throttle before. Now the Kraken X62, I could have this i9 at 5.2 gigahertz all cores, and I'd hit in the neighborhood of like 90, 95 degrees Celsius. But that was also running Linux, so it's not a fair comparison, and I only overclock when I'm rendering a video, and then I go back to a stock clock to conserve power, because there's no point running this fully overclocked all the time when I'm not actually using it. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, this sucks. I wasted tons of money. I basically got absolutely nowhere with thermals, so it was all a giant waste of time. It looks really neat, so that's really cool, but it definitely wasn't worth the amount of money and the headache of trying to get this 420 millimeter rad in the case. Even though they said it fits, I mean, it clearly doesn't because I had to cut this bracket just to get it to fit with the bottom fans. I don't know. That's basically it. I'm going to rip the entire computer apart again once I get everything to run liquid metal, and I'm going to replace with a copper integrated heat spreader. And that's basically it. If I can find that new motherboard that I'm after, then I'll also throw that in at the same time. If not, same motherboard's going in. And I have no reason to be upgrading the GPU right now. This one still handles every game that I play at the absolute cranked graphics, and I get more than 60 frames per second. So I'm completely content with that. I'm extremely disappointed with this case. I highly recommend that under no instance you buy one of these. It looks really good, but in order to get the full benefit out of it, it's just not worth it. And for the price, if you're not going to be utilizing the full benefits of this case, then you're spending a ridiculous amount of money only for the aesthetic, and there's only a certain point where that becomes worthwhile, and this does not fall into that category in my opinion. So hopefully you got something out of this. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it because like that's cool. Like this sucked. I hate everything about this, and I'm really feeling rather defeated. So I don't really even want to edit this video, but I don't know. Join the members program if you want to help me support all of this stuff. Subscribe if you haven't. That's cool. That helps out. Or I don't know. Don't do any of it. I'm not telling you what to do.